Well, good morning, fellowship. How are we doing this morning? Good. Did anybody bring a Bible to church this morning? If you did, hold it up. If you have your phone, that's good as well. This morning, we're going to use this thing, and we're going to dive straight into a story that we're going to look at. Genesis chapter 4. So open it up. Genesis chapter 4. We're continuing this series. We're looking at some of these things that we find in every single one of us. Without exception, these things that we're looking at, we find in every one of us. And the problem with these things is that so often, when left unchecked, they are extremely dangerous. These things that we find inside of us, they conspire to actually destroy our lives. And so this morning, as we continue this series, we're going to look at this story about two brothers named Cain and Abel. As we read this story, Genesis chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 1. I want you to pay attention to the story. You might have read it before. Even if you have, pay attention, because this morning I want you to see if you can identify the fatal flaw that we see in this story. All right, Genesis chapter 4, let's start in verse 1. It says, Adam lay with his wife Eve. She became pregnant, and she gave birth to Cain, the very first man born of a woman on earth. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. And later she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were there in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel, and he killed him. Right, so let's pause here in the story. There's a little bit more of this story to come, but let's just pause because I want to make sure that we're all tracking with this story that we might be familiar with, right? It's a story of two brothers. They both, at a certain point in their life, the word doesn't say exactly what point, but let's assume it's a little later in life, right? These are the first two men ever born to woman on earth, Cain and Abel, and these two brothers bring this offering to God. Right? And so it seems like a fairly simple story. They both bring an offering to God, and the word says that God prefers one offering over the other. And then we arrive at verse 8. Cain attacked his brother and killed him. And I don't know if you're tracking with this story, but as I'm studying over the last few weeks, I think to myself, it's not completely logical. Right? That's what I want to press into this morning. It doesn't completely make sense that these two brothers, who are both honoring God by bringing their offering, now God, he might have preferred one of their offerings over the other, but the response from one brother is to kill the other. And so the question I want to begin with this morning is why? Why would Cain kill his brother Abel? And I want to have a little bit of an interaction this morning, so why don't you turn to your neighbor? And I'm looking for three possible answers. Come up with three possibilities. Why did Cain decide to kill his brother? One's not good enough. I'm looking for three. Go. Chat about it. I like the chatter. I like the discussion. I know I asked you to come up with three, but hopefully you did it in the last 60 seconds. Here we go. I'm looking for some answers. 3 possibilities. Why did Cain kill his brother Abel? Go ahead. Let's start to get some hands raised here. Yes. Good. Are you married? Both together, in unison. Jealousy. Wonderful. What else? Yep. Remove the competition. I like that. First service didn't think of that one. That's good. Yes, what else? There's lots of possibilities. That's why I'm looking for 3. Jessica? Shame. Okay, what else do we have? Anger, malice, a few more. Envy, anything else? Pride, what was it over here? One more time. Sibling rivalry. Yeah. All of these things are very good thoughts. All of these things are very possible. And I think there was actually a lot of emotion wrapped up in the reason, the motivation for Cain to actually kill his brother in this story. Bible scholars suggest they're all in unison about this. The reason was envy, right? Envy was what actually gave birth to and motivated every other emotion that this man Cain was experiencing that led him to kill his brother. And so that's what I want to talk about this morning. We want to talk about this fatal flaw of envy. And what you need to know this morning, the problem of envy is that it always makes your blessed life feel inadequate. Right? We're going to talk about that a lot this morning. Envy always makes your blessed life feel inadequate. I don't know if you've ever found this to be true, but I saw a picture of this play out right in front of me several years ago. Was anybody ever a camp counselor? Anyone with me? Yes. I was a camp counselor at a lot of different summer camps, kind of in my high school and college years. I worked at this one particular summer camp in the state of Maine for 3 summers in a row. And I got to tell you up front, I don't know how I actually find myself in scenarios like this sometimes, but it was a little bit different type of a camp. Now, in many ways, it was the exact same camp that maybe you grew up going to. Kids wore tie-dye shirts, they did lake activities, they did arts and crafts, there were cabins, there were campfires, there was kind of all the normal summer camp stuff. And yet this camp was a little bit different because it was a camp that existed for the very richest kids in the entire world. Again, I'm not sure exactly how. I didn't go looking for this camp opportunity, but it's in the state of Maine. And the richest, the wealthiest kids from the wealthiest families in the entire world, they all come to this camp every single summer, right? And so my very first summer, I'm not exactly sure what I'm getting into. I played soccer, and so I was a soccer counselor, and they assigned me a cabin full of 10 or 11 boys. They were all 12 years old. I want to give you an example of some of the boys in my cabin that very first year. I had the son of the NHL hockey commissioner. I had the son of the owner of Sony Records. I had Mariah Carey's stepson. I can't make this stuff up, by the way. And I had the Prince of Jordan in my camp, like the actual heir to the throne. He's actually the king of Jordan now. I didn't ask him if I could share this story. I didn't have his contact details at this point. Those are the kids in my cabin, right? And like I said, the camp is totally normal. It's kind of the same type of camp that you all and I experienced growing up, but it's a little bit different just because of the clientele. Subsequently, they serve filet mignon and lobster every Friday. Most of the kids have bodyguards, especially the Prince of Jordan. Parents, true story, come to camp for Parents' Weekend. See, this is a 2-month thing. They send their kids off, and they're for 2 months in the same cabin, living with the counselor. So there's a Parents' Weekend. They arrive, these parents, by one of 2 means. Either by helicopter or by seaplane, which they land on this camp's private lake. Right, so here's what you learn working at a camp like that. It's very interesting. Kids are all the same. And I'm sure you've experienced that, right? It doesn't matter if you're the Prince of Jordan, you're Mariah Carey's stepson, kids are all the same. And so there's this one day that we win this award. My cabin, we win this award. We have the very cleanest cabin in camp. And so I don't really understand why this is so motivating, but the kids get ice cream. right? Kids are all the same. So these kids are pumped up, right? The Prince of Joy, ice cream, like he is pumped up. He's going to get some mint chip ice cream, and we win the award. So we're going down the lake, middle of the day. We're going to eat ice cream in front of all the other kids. Now, we win the award. It may or may not have something to do with Mariah Carey. She hires a housekeeper that may or may not have helped us clean our cabin every day. You don't make this stuff up, people, I'm telling you. But we won the award. That's what I'm telling you. We won the award. We marched ourselves down to the lake, and I love it, right? Because the kids are happy. Have you seen a kid with ice cream? I've seen you with ice cream, right? I know how you react. You're eating the ice cream, you're having a good time, and these kids are just having a great time. I notice the Prince of Jordan is sitting on the dock with Mariah Carey's son, and they're laughing. And they're teasing each other like 12-year-old boys do, and they're joking around, and everything's going great until the prince notices Mariah Carey's son is eating his ice cream, right? And so I'm watching this play out, and I'm kind of sitting back on like a rock back in the back, and the prince gets up. He marches up to me, and this kid, he holds his bowl of ice cream right in my face. He's like, "We got a problem." I'm like, "Okay, what's that?" He's like, "I need more ice cream." So I'm like, "Well, first of all, why, right? You got his bowl was like heaped up, like 6 scoops of ice cream in this kid's bowl. And no joke, this kid, he looks over and he points at Mariah Carey's stepson. This kid's still sitting on the dock, he's eating his ice cream quietly. He says, "Well, that kid, he's got more than me." True story. This is the Prince of Jordan, right? He is concerned because that kid has more ice cream than he does. You see, kids are all the same. Doesn't really matter. When it comes to envy, envy doesn't discriminate. And the problem with envy, right? It's applicable to all of us, and the problem is it always makes your blessed life feel inadequate. Right? Again, I don't know if you've experienced this. I love how Andy Stanley puts it, right? He's talking about envy. He says envy is this emotion. That's important to note. Envy is an emotion. Envy is this emotion that causes us to want to add an ER to the end of whatever adjectives we would choose to describe us. Have you ever thought about that? I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but some of you have. And I know that because we asked you to come in and we filmed you talking about it, right? And so I want to show you a quick video. Some of you who sit right out there, not one of your pastors, just talking about this idea or this emotion of envy. Check this out.
So for me, I'm a missionary kid. I grew up in the mission field. My family was very different. My family was from India, and we were trying to kind of find our way in a new culture. And so honestly, I think I was envious of kids that seemed like they had normal lives, or they were very comfortable in the culture that we were so desperately trying to fit in and find our way in.
I have been envious over the years of people that are more talented and smarter than I am. That is a really big group of people, so there's a lot of ways for me to be envious, and I work with some really bright people, and it's very humbling.
I was the 4th daughter, and I never got one new item of clothes except it was Christmas, because I had hand-me-downs. And so I was always envious of my friend Amy Howard's clothes, because she got to go shopping twice a year and get brand new clothes, and I thought, that is so awesome, and I never got to do that.
Going into today, I noticed that I'm usually envious of people's places in life. Like back when I was in a relationship, I would be super envious of, those cool girls on Instagram who were support raising to go share the gospel all around the world. And then now in a place of singleness, I'm like, oh man, like, Lord, where's my husband at,
I remember when I was in my freshman year of high school, I tried out for the basketball team, and I didn't make the basketball team. And all those kids that made it, that were looking at the who made it list, outside the locker room, and I wasn't on that list, and I felt so like jealous and envious of like the position that they are in, and it literally felt like the end of the world for me. Nothing could heal that. Like I felt so horrible. It was like the worst feeling in my stomach.
Have you ever been in that position? You really want something and you're looking at the who made it list, right? And your name's not there. I just so appreciate these guys who took time to come and speak very transparently. Over this series, we've had them, the same group of people, talk on all of these different fatal flaws that we've been looking at. And it's not easy to share some of your emotions and some of your deepest feelings kind of in a group of your peers. So I really, really appreciate it. And as I was watching this particular piece this week, as I was preparing for this message, I started to think to myself, what is one thing that stands out about what they were saying? And as I was watching this, I don't know if you picked it up, but as they're talking about envy, what I noticed is nobody said, I just really want to be rich. Nobody said, like the thing about my life is I just really, really want to be cool. Or smart, or skinny, right? Nobody was saying that, right? And I think this is what Andy Stanley, this pastor in Atlanta, was getting at when he said what we really want when it comes to envy is we want to add an ER to whatever adjective it is that we would like to describe us, right? And so it's not that we want to be rich. What we really want is very simply to be richer than the people around us. Right? Because how do we know if we're rich? Right? How do we know what we have? It is a comparison. And it's not really that we want to be smart as long as we are smarter than others. Skinnier, cooler, right? We really just want to add an ER to the end of whatever adjective we want to describe us. And I was kind of thinking to myself, yeah, maybe, but he really didn't get me until I read this quote. Andy Stanley says this. He says, we all want our friends to have smart, kind, funny kids. We just want our kids to be smarter, kinder, and funnier. Anyone? You don't have to raise your hand. I know it's true. Right? I was talking to somebody after the first service. They're like, you got me, right? This is true of all of us. It's not that we're against other people. It's not that we want other people to have a bad life or we don't want them to be smart or skinny or cool. As long as we are smarter, skinnier, and cooler than them. That's envy. And the reality of envy is it makes our inadequate or our blessed life always feel inadequate. Envy is defined as an emotion, right? I told you that was going to come into play. Envy is an emotion that occurs when a person lacks another's superior quality, another's superior achievement, or another's superior possessions. I'd kind of summarize this, maybe state it more simply. Envy is simply wanting what you don't have. That's envy, wanting what you don't have. It's feeling like whatever you have, it's not enough, right? Whatever you have, it's inadequate. That maybe you deserve more, that maybe you're actually entitled to more. I mean, do they know who I am? Do they know what I've done? That's envy. And maybe if you think about envy, you might think to yourself, well, it's not actually that bad, right? It's not really such a big deal, right? After all, what is envy? Envy is really just a little bit of discontentment, right? You're discontent because you look around you and you realize that certain people have more than you, and so it creates this emotion, this feeling inside of you, and the feeling is actually discontentment, right? Here's what you need to understand. You might want to write this down. Discontentment. With what you have, it quickly turns into resentment towards others who have the thing you want. Think about it. Discontentment. With what you have, it quickly turns into resentment towards other people who have the thing that you want. See, this is exactly what happens in this story of these two brothers, Cain and Abel. Let's look again at Genesis chapter 4, verse 4. It says, the Lord looked with favor on the one brother Abel, right? Abel brings his offering, and the word says, Genesis 4:4, God looks with favor. God prefers, God likes this offering. Verse 5, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. And so I'm trying to understand, what was the motivation for Cain to do what he ultimately does in verse 8? Right? And I'm thinking about this, right? God looks with favor, God prefers, he enjoys, he likes one offering, he doesn't like another. What does this actually mean? What is God actually saying to us here, right? Was it that in this scenario that God looked on this brother, Cain, and he decided that he hated him? Right? Did God actually reject Cain's offering? Does it say that? Does it say that God abandoned Cain because of what he brought before him? Does it say God told Cain that his breath smelled like tuna, that he'd never amount to anything? Right? Just kind of go with me a little bit, because what's it actually saying? And to me, it's not saying any of those things. It's very clear. The word says God favored Abel's offering over Cain's. So I want you to see this. Look at verse 5. Look at how Cain responds. God favors Abel's offering. Look what Cain does in response. Verse 5 says this, so Cain was very angry. Anything stand out to you about that sentence? So Cain was very angry. Anything? Just shout it out. What stands out to you? It seems obvious, right? It seems so clear you don't want to shout it out. What stands out to me is not the fact that Cain was angry. That makes sense to me. It's the inclusion of this word, very. Look around in the Bible. It's not very often that biblical writers include this qualifying statement, right? He was not just angry. If Moses, who's writing this book, would have just said, you know what, Cain was angry, we would have all 2,000 years later been like, yep, I get it. Cain was angry. No, he chose to include this word, very. In the Hebrew, this word, it signifies this intensity of emotion. Right? And so when the author includes this word very to demonstrate the emotion that Cain is feeling, what he's really saying is Cain's anger, it was a lot more like rage. Cain's anger, it was a lot more like he was incensed. He was seething. This guy was about to go nuclear because he was so angry. And here's a really important point, and I didn't notice it until this very week. I bet you I've read this story 50 times before. I've studied it. I did a class on this in seminary about the book of Genesis. I never really internalized the reality of who Cain was angry with until this very week. Who do you think Cain is angry with? He wasn't just angry, he was very angry. So let's take a little poll, right? I'll give you two options. You got to vote, okay? Option number 1, Cain was very angry with his brother. Who wants, yep, good, yep, go ahead. There's no wrong answer unless you give the wrong one. Cain was very angry. Okay, good, I got it. Who thinks that Cain, there's only 2 options, so there's only 1 option left. Last option, Cain was very angry with God. Okay, a majority of us, right? If you raised your hand, Cain was very angry with his brother Abel. That was the wrong answer, right? That was the only wrong answer there was, but there was only 2 options. Cain, and I'm telling you, I never really thought about, think about this, how this plays out. Cain looks at how God is interacting with his brother Abel. So he becomes angry. Who's he angry with? God. But who does he take it out on? Have you experienced this? And of course, none of us have experienced this. None of us have been the ones that actually have done this, where we become angry and we take it out on somebody who doesn't actually deserve it, right? I'm sure that you're not one of those, right? But I bet you have been the recipient. Husbands and wives, I'm not going to call anyone out specifically. Sometimes this plays out in our relationship with our spouse. It's the most intimate relationship that we have here on earth. And sometimes our anger is displaced, and we take it out on the person closest to us. Cain was angry at God, but he killed his brother, Abel. It's a really important thing to understand. If you're looking at this emotion of envy and you think to yourself, well, it's not really that big of a deal because nobody really can see in my heart. Nobody really knows if I'm just a little bit envious. Look at how it plays out in Cain's life, right? If you find yourself thinking to yourself sometimes, well, it's just not fair, right? That's not fair. Or who do they think they are? And why do they always get the recognition? Why is it them who seems more blessed than me? If you ever think thoughts like that, again, really hard to kind of look at envy in the face. These are some indicators that you might have envy in your heart if you have thoughts like this. Let me give you a few more. Right, I'm going to go pretty quick here. A few more possible causes, but also indicators that you've got some envy in your heart. Bear in mind, none of us think that we've actually got envy, right? We might think to ourselves, well, sometimes I feel envious, but none of us think that envy is actually living inside of us. Let me give you some examples that might suggest that it is. You have a strong desire to have what other people have. If that's how you feel, you might have some envy. I'm not telling you you do. I'm just giving you some indicators. Are you an insecure person? You have a sense of unworthiness, not feeling good enough. Maybe you've got some poor boundaries. Maybe you aren't aware of your own strength. See, these are indicators that you might have some envy, unresolved resentment, fear, anger. That was kind of where Cain was at. Lack of attachment to a significant other. An inflated sense of ego, maybe even bordering on narcissism. Right? Are you a person that has a difficult time reflecting on your own scenario, your own situation? See, these are just a few. There are more, but these are a few causes, but also indicators. Maybe there's some envy in your life. Right? And again, I'm sure that none of us carry these characteristics. None of us deal with this, but the reality is we think we don't, but we probably do. The Word says, and this is what we've been talking about this whole series, all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And I'm going to show you in just a second how envy is one of the most deadly sins out there. Why? Because just as Andy Stanley says, it gives birth to so many others, right? It motivates, it is the cause of so many other emotions that we have. And so I hate to be the bearer of bad news this morning, but when you think about envy, the reality is you probably have some in your life. You might not realize this. You might not have thought about this. I don't know if you use this. But here's what sociologists say about envy. I was reading this article in, I think it was Psychology Today, and there's this sociologist talking about the reality that envy is far greater in our generation than any generation of people that have ever come before us. Right? Does that make sense to you? Anyone have any idea why? Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. I'm not coming against it. I'm just going to point something out to you really, really quick here this morning. I'm not a social media architect, right? I'm not a social networking architect, but it would seem, as you look at social media, that it was actually created to play on envy, right? Because here's what we know. Think about this. Envy, it's fueled by comparison. Have you ever thought about that? Envy is fueled by comparison. And it might not be your conscious thought. You might not get onto the internet or onto your phone, and you might not intend to or want to or have this intentional desire. But the reality is that so often, when we look at other people's lives, especially on social media, we compare our life to theirs. Again, it's not necessarily what you want to do. It's not necessarily what you intended to do. It just happens. Right? Let me give you an example of this. Valentine's Day was last week, right? Anybody do anything special? I'm going to give you an example. I didn't ask my wife if I could do this, tell you about our Valentine's Day, but let me tell you what I can tell you here in church about our Valentine's Day, okay? I should have told you, maybe. I spent the night cuddled up by a warm fire, drinking some I love coffee. We had some delicious coffee, had this great conversation, laughing all night, and just telling funny stories with Pastor Joe. And it was, let me tell you, it was romantic, right? I'm not sure what you were doing, right? Pastor Joe and I, we were in Ethiopia together. Some of you might have been there, and it was a great night, that Valentine's Day, right? So I don't know, did you do anything with Pastor Joe? You probably didn't. I did. But what'd you do for Valentine's Day? You know, some of you might have been thinking to yourself on Valentine's Day, man, this is the greatest Valentine's Day ever. You know, maybe wives, you're thinking to yourself, my husband came home, he brought me chocolate. He brought me a bouquet of flowers. He made me a home-cooked meal. And you're like, man, I'm on cloud 9. Until that night you get on Facebook, right? Just go with me for a second, right? Because you're looking around at Facebook and you're thinking to yourself, this was the greatest Valentine's Day that we've ever had in our 25 years of marriage, until you see your girlfriend. And apparently, her husband bought her a horse. Right? And they went backpacking, riding the horse through Europe, right? And somehow he got the entire cast of Hamilton to go with them on horseback as they saw all the sights and took pictures, selfies of, and we don't know anything. I told you just go with me. It's fictitious, by the way, and I made that up. But we don't know anything about that couple. Right? We look at them, we see them on Facebook, we see them on social media. We don't know. They might be on the brink of divorce. Right? It's fictitious, but this is true stuff, right? We see people and we're like, oh, wow, like, hey, honey, get in here. Have you seen so-and-so? Can you believe, right? Like, there's a picture of, some brownies and the wife showing the brownies, and you're not even seeing the brownies. Did you see her countertop? Like, this is unbelievable, and the color on her wall. That's what we do, right? I don't need you to tell me that you do this. I know you do this. I do this, right? Maybe it's not about countertops. I'm not sure. What do I do that about? But I do that. We don't know what's going on in their lives. We don't know what's happening. You see, I love what one person said about social media. So this is the problem with social media. We compare our behind-the-scenes footage with others' highlight reels. Right? And so subsequently, sometimes we feel like losers because we see the best of their best, and yet we know the absolute worst of our worst. That's the reality. We're looking at the best of the best of the best of what people put forward, and we know the worst of our worst. And I'm not saying that Satan came and created Facebook. That's not what I'm saying. Hear me right this morning. I'm not against it. I'm not against social media. I think actually social media is a great tool for the gospel. I think we actually live in a generation and an era that the gospel can go forward in more creative ways than ever before. All I'm telling you, it's a warning. Envy, it's fueled by comparison. And we don't mean to. We might not want to. We might not intend to. And yet when we look at other people's lives, it's our natural inclination to compare. The problem is envy. It always makes our blessed life feel what? Inadequate. Envy always makes our blessed life feel inadequate. Listen to what Martin Luther, the great reformer, once said. Last week, Aaron DeLoach preached an amazing message on hypocrisy. If you didn't hear it, you got to hear it. Go online. One of the best messages I've heard in a long, long time. Check it out. He said last week, it's like he's comparing. It's like Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and then he said Charles Spurgeon. Well, he forgot about Martin Luther, right? Let's insert Martin Luther right up there as one of the most trusted, reliable. I mean, he is a saint of the faith. Here's what Martin Luther said when commenting on envy. He said, God concluded the Ten Commandments with, thou shalt not covet, which means envy. Thou shalt not envy, because if you kept that one, you'd keep all the others. The reason you steal, the reason you lie, commit adultery, even kill, is because you envy, because you covet. You see, the reality is that envy is really serious stuff. And James, the half-brother of Jesus, he spoke about the severity of envy, right? If anybody knew anything about envy, right, I would think it would be James. Who was his brother? Jesus, right? And so you find that James, he writes a lot about envy, right? So check out what James says about envy. James 3, verse 14. He says, if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, don't boast about it or deny the truth. He says, such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual. You ready for this? Are you seeing that? And of the devil. That's not how I usually think about envy, right? Such wisdom is earthly, unspiritual, and of the devil. Verse 16 says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find these things, disorder and evil practices of every kind. That was left out there. It says, and evil practice of every kind. And so James, half-brother of Jesus, now granted, he's looking at Jesus, he's like, man, I cannot compete, right? He's writing about the problem. This is a guy that probably knows something about envy. He knows the severity of it in our lives. And the truth is, so does God. Look what happens in Genesis chapter 4. Right? God sees the envy in Cain's heart, the very first human born of a woman. He sees the envy in his heart. And so Genesis 4, verse 6. The Lord goes, and I imagine that God sits down with Cain. He's got his hand maybe around his shoulder. And he's like, why are you angry? Why is your face so downcast, Cain? He says, if you just did what was right, surely wouldn't you be accepted? But if you don't do what is right, he warns him, sin, it's crouching at your door. The problem is sin desires to have you. And so God goes to Cain and he warns him. He's like, trust me, it's not going to go well for you if you don't deal with the sin that I see in your heart, right? All sin and fall short of the glory of God. We all share this unfortunate sin nature. The reality is, it's in us, right? It dwells in us, and what God is saying to Cain is the same thing he's saying to you and I this morning. You got to deal with it. Trust me, it's not going to go well for you. If you let it fester, if you leave it unchecked, if you let it just kind of go, well, that's just a little small kind of, it's a big deal. Trust me, it's a big deal. And yet notice what God says to Cain. Right, I already said it, but notice this in verse 7. God says, if you do what is right, won't you be accepted? See, this is the good news for Cain. And I want you to know this morning that this is the good news for you and for me. That even though God sees the depths of Cain's sin nature, even though God knows the very lowest of your low, He knows the worst of your worst, the good news this morning is there's hope. You see, that's the message of the gospel. And this is a profound mystery of the faith that I find myself thinking about so often. One thing I love about Jesus is that while you and we still have breath in our lungs, it's not too late to accept Jesus into our heart. Right? While you have breath in your lungs, you can still accept the forgiveness of Christ in your heart. Romans 5:8 says, while we were yet sinners, right? It wasn't that we had cleaned ourselves up. It wasn't that we had got ourselves kind of respectable and presentable so we could stand before God. Paul says, while you were still dead in your transgressions, what happened? Jesus, he went to the cross. He died that your sin would not separate you any longer from the life God created you to live. And so, yeah, we've inherited this sin nature, and we have these fatal flaws that still exist within us. But the great news of the gospel is that we don't have to exist separated from our Heavenly Father. Last thing I want to point out this morning. See, Cain had a choice. And I think we see that at some point in all of the stories we've been looking at, in all of these fatal flaws, there comes this moment where this person gets to choose. Right? God comes to Cain, puts his arm around him. Trust me, Cain, it's not going to go well for you. But verse 7, but if you do what is right, come on, you're going to be accepted. And in that moment, Cain got to choose. For him, it was envy. And maybe for you, it might be the same. Am I going to deal? Am I going to acknowledge my envy? Am I going to come to God and repent, which means to turn away from? Am I going to ask him to forgive me that I might be again in right standing? Or not? It's a really simple choice, and yet it's so hard for some of us to make sometimes. I'm telling you, it's so hard for me sometimes when I see the sin in my life to just acknowledge it and say, yep, that's me. God says that sin in your life is like this lion. Satan is compared to a lion. It says sin crouches at your door. That's the reality. Right now, where you sit, even in church, sin is crouching at the door of your life, conspiring to destroy you. And I'm not trying to be a downer this morning. I just want you to look at the reality of where we are as people, but the great news that Jesus died for you. And so here's what I want to do this morning. I'm not going to ask you to get up or move around or raise your hand this morning right now. I want to create a space for us this morning. Right? So often we're out there and we're running here and we're going there and we're doing all these things, and we never get a space to examine our heart. And so for 90 seconds, 2 minutes, I've asked the band to play, and I just want you to quiet your heart. I want you to close your eyes, maybe even right now. I want you to bow your heads. And I want you to think, what's the state of my heart? Is there sin in my heart? Is there envy in my heart? I want you to let God begin to work. I'm going to pray for us in just a minute or two, but really take advantage of this time. remain in a posture of prayer this morning. Head bowed, eyes closed. And I want you to just think about Jesus on the cross. Jesus who cried out, "It is finished." You see, when Jesus made this proclamation, he was saying that your sin no longer has to separate you from God. It's finished. I've paid the ultimate price. And yet we all have a choice. And so this morning, I want you to know it's not too late. You see, if you've this morning realized maybe you've got some sin in your life, maybe you've got some envy, what I want you to understand this morning is that there is an antidote to envy, and it's contentment. Contentment is the antidote to envy. Because contentment, it acknowledges that everything that we have, it comes from God. And yet envy, it declares, whatever I've got, it's not enough. And so this morning, I want to ask you to choose. Would you choose envy, or would you choose contentment? And I want you to know that the beginning of contentment is Jesus Christ. There is no contentment this side of heaven outside of a relationship with God. And so this morning, if you're here and God has been speaking to you through these words, I want you to know that He is offering you an opportunity to acknowledge your sin, to repent, and to turn away. If you're here this morning, I want to pray for you. If God's been speaking to you, and if you're honest, every eye is closed, every head is bowed, and you would say, you know what, Pastor? I have never acknowledged my sin, full stop. I've never come before God and asked Jesus, His Son, to forgive me of my sin. And if this morning you want a relationship with God, and you want to know the life that He's created you for, it doesn't matter what you came in here with. I'm telling you, you can walk out with Christ, and He is enough. And so if that's you this morning, I want to lead you in a prayer. Nobody's looking around. Every eye is closed, every head is bowed. If that's you this morning, on the count of 3, why don't you just raise your hand and I'm just going to lead you in a prayer. If you want Jesus to connect you with God this morning, this is your moment. I'm telling you, these are the words of God. This is your moment. On the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Raise your hand. Wonderful. In the front, in the back. Wonderful. On the side, in the middle. In the middle. Wonderful. In the middle. In the very back. Yep, on the far right. Great. Yep, on the far right. Wonderful. This is your moment. If you're here this morning and you know, wonderful, in the very middle. Great, I got you. I'm just going to lead you in a very simple prayer. Anybody else? This is a moment between you and God. This isn't a moment for our church. You might never walk back into this church. If you raise your hand and you want to connect your life to God, pray this simple prayer right where you sit. Jesus, I acknowledge my sin. I ask that you would forgive me. I ask that you'd come into my life, that you'd make me a new creation, that you'd help me to honor you, that you'd help me to glorify you, and that you would help me to live my life for your purposes and your purpose alone. And I want to just pray a quick prayer for the rest of us. If you're here and you know Christ and you know there's some envy in your life, we all do. I just want to pray this prayer of you. Jesus, I thank you that your word says that Jesus Christ is enough. That on the cross of Calvary, His blood shed and His body broken, it was enough. And even though we live in this world of competition, we can find our assurance in the resurrected Jesus. So God, that's my prayer this morning, that as we walk out of this building, we would have this renewed sense and this renewed belief and this renewed confidence that Jesus Christ, He is enough. Father, we love you this morning. We thank you that you've been at work in our lives today. We all pray these things together, declaring that Christ is enough.